In June of this year, the new biography, The Joy Goddess, burst onto the literary summer scene. It chronicles the life of early 20th century society maven, wealthy businesswoman, and arbiter of the arts from Missouri to Manhattan to Monte Carlo, A'Lelia Walker, daughter of the famed African-American millionaire, Madam C.J. Walker. Equal parts racy narrative and scholarly tome, the book is thoroughly researched and lovingly written by their descendant, journalist and author, A'Lelia Bundles. It fixes the historical spotlight squarely on A'Lelia Walker, a cultural and civic leader of her time, whose life has heretofore been subsumed by her mother's blinding success and larger-than-life personality. The Joy Goddess is a story of family and legacy, entrepreneurial savvy, cultural influence, and political impact of loves lost and found through 5 generations. I'm Isisara Bey, Artistic Director of March On, and I'm so pleased and delighted to welcome my friend and colleague, the author of the book, A'Lelia Bundles. Welcome.
Isisara, it's always good to be with you.
Indeed, sis. We've been doing this a long time.
We have.
So let's first outline the family tree. It took me a minute to kind of put all of the A'Lelias together in order. So we start with Madam C.J. Walker, then.
So Madam C.J. Walker had one daughter, A'Lelia Walker. Mm-hmm. A'Lelia Walker adopted my grandmother, whose name was May. And May and my grandfather, Marion Perry, had one daughter whose name was A'Lelia May Perry, named after her mother and great-grandmother. And my mother and father had me, and I am A'Lelia Perry Bundles. So there's Madam Walker, A'Lelia Walker, May Walker Perry, A'Lelia May Perry, and me, A'Lelia Perry Bundles.
Wow. And May was Fairy May, is that right?
That's right. My grandmother's birth name was Fairy May Bryant.
I love that. So with all of those progenitors in your family, tell me, how were Madam C.J. and A'Lelia talked about while you were growing up? What was the family story about them?
Well, the silverware that we used every day had Madam Walker's monogram, CJW. The baby grand piano that was in my living room had been in A'Lelia Walker's apartment in Harlem. That's the piano on which I learned to read music. And my mother was vice president of the Madam C.J. Walker Manufacturing Company. So the Walker women were all around me, though we did not sit around the dinner table talking about them, but they were just kind of there in the ether.
So what inspired you to write this book about A'Lelia? You wrote about her mother with On Her Ground. What prompted now the book about the daughter?
You know, the truth is, A'Lelia Walker was the ancestor who initially inspired me and stimulated my interest. When I was a really little girl, I discovered things that had belonged to her in my grandmother's dresser drawer. I would open that dresser drawer when my mother and I would visit her father. Her mother had died when she was a freshman at Howard, but we would go to my grandparents' apartment, and I opened the drawer as a little girl and found a big ostrich feather fan and mother of pearl opera glasses and these miniature mummy charms that I later would learn A'Lelia Walker bought in Cairo in 1922. So I was fascinated by her, and I shared a name with her and almost the same birthday. My birthday is June 7th, hers was June 6th. Then in high school, as I was discovering Black authors like Langston Hughes and Countee Cullen and Zora Neale Hurston and Jean Toomer, we had those books in our house, and I was so excited that I had an ancestor that knew these people, knew these writers. So she was really the one who fascinated me initially. Madam Walker was more complicated, and I began to write about Madam Walker when I was a graduate student at Columbia in journalism. But A'Lelia, I always wanted to come back to telling A'Lelia Walker's story.
So I'm picturing you and your mother going through the drawers. I used to do the same thing with my mother. There's nothing more fascinating than a mommy or grandma's drawer. And did you try on some of the clothes and the pins and kind of get caught up in that world?
Absolutely. I think there was a point, there was a belt that I found, a beaded belt. And, this was in the 60s, the hippie era, the early 1970s. And I wore a few of those things. There was a necklace that A'Lelia Walker had that appears in a photograph that the famous photographer Bernice Abbott took of her. And I had that necklace. And so there were items that I would wear, but still at that point didn't really fully understand who these women were.
Yeah. Do you wear them now?
I do. I think probably like most people, I have the same 3 or 4 pieces that I wear over and over again, but they are nearby. But I think the thing that is really the touchstone for me is these little mummy charms. And I have had occasion to take them out recently as I've been telling the story. And these were little charms that A'Lelia Walker bought them in Cairo, and she bought a few dozen of them to be able to give them as gifts to people. But I have just a half dozen or so of them, but I really treasure those.
Oh, that's so wonderful, having that history right there in your hands. So as I was reading the book, I was going through the eras of Miss A'Lelia, the Reconstruction, the beginning of the Great Migration, World War I, and the Harlem Renaissance. She was living in some exciting times. So that period of the Harlem Renaissance, I think, was the flowering also of her adulthood. Can you tell us about what that scene was like and how she got into it?
One of the things that I really love about telling the story of Madam Walker and A'Lelia Walker is that I'm able to look at American history through the lens of these 2 Black women who are representative of their times. And as you say, A'Lelia Walker was born in 1885 during Reconstruction and then lived through these other eras. And I think she was very poor when she was growing up in St. Louis. Her mother was still a washerwoman. So I could look at that era where it was the ragtime era in St. Louis. For a while, they lived across the alley from Tom Turpin's Rosebud Cafe, where Scott Joplin played. She would see people, the cakewalk dancers who would go past her uncle's barbershop in St. Louis. So she was seeing that culture, that development of culture, even as a young person. And then after she and her mother had money, after they had wealth, and after they were living in New York and had these beautiful homes and they were entertaining other people, I could see how she was coming into her own as a person who appreciated culture, who appreciated music and the arts and theater, and how she turned that into her support of many of these creative people during the Harlem Renaissance.
So you named some of the names of the people who were her running buddies around the time. So talk a little bit more about how she impacted this arts scene, this literary scene of the Harlem Renaissance.
I think that this upbringing in St. Louis was really influential because there were people, some names that we don't remember now, but Sam Patterson, who was a very famous orchestra leader, Georgette Harvey, who was the first Maria in Porgy and Bess. They were the same age. They went to the same church. And so she was seeing, all of these really creative people. And as Madam Walker was developing her business and traveling throughout the United States, the Caribbean, and Central America, the other people who were as mobile or more mobile than she and A'Lelia were the musicians and the theater people. So they were meeting people like Bert Williams, who was a very famous musician during the time, James Reese Europe, another one of the sort of fathers of jazz. And that mobility and that intersection with these women who were in business and these creative theater and music people helped to create that community that she was helping to support and foster.
So when you're talking about them being on the road and the musicians being on the road, it must have been big fun to run into each other in different cities as they were performing or if they were doing business. And it reminds me a little bit, this little off topic, but of the Pullman Porters and the role they played in helping the Green Book come to pass by talking about places where Black people could gather or to eat or have hotel rooms or have entertainment in the segregated South. So even though it was segregation and under that onus, there seems to be a lot of unity and connection and communication. From the book, I got the sense that both A'Lelia and her mother were what we would call race women at the time, even though they weren't political people. How would you talk about or describe some of the impact they had on the push for equality in this country?
Well, yes, absolutely. They were race people. And I would say Madam Walker was actually quite political in the sense that as she developed her company and as she was encouraging and cultivating her sales agents, she finally held a convention, national convention in 1917. And at that convention, she was giving women tips on how to run their businesses. But at the convention, she said to them, I want you to understand that as Walker agents, your first duty is to humanity. I want others to look at us and realize that we care not just about ourselves, but about others. She gave prizes not just to the women who sold the most products, but to the women who had contributed the most to charity. And at the end of the convention, the women sent a telegram to President Woodrow Wilson urging him to support legislation to make lynching a federal crime. And I think she was so much of a social justice activist that she and Ida B. Wells were spied upon by a Black spy in the War Department because they were so outspoken about the rights for African Americans and about the rights of Black soldiers. But Madam Walker was much more political, much more of an activist than A'Lelia Walker. A'Lelia Walker cared about those things. She and her friends and her circle of friends cared about lynching. They cared about Jim Crow. They cared about the segregation and the racism. But they were the next generation and they were doing their activism in a different way. At the same time, A'Lelia Walker during World War I, in Harlem, where the 369th was based, hosted events, hosted fundraisers, and in fact, led the campaign to raise money to buy an ambulance for Black soldiers during World War I. So she was trying to fashion her own approach to activism, but it really came in the form of the arts for her.
Which was powerful, so she could curate events and exhibits and really lend her talents as an entrepreneur to that. So she has entrepreneur and businesswoman and speaker and arts maven. She had many hats coming from a poor beginning, acquiring wealth. How did she handle the bigness of her life? All of the hats that she wore.
Well, I think it is a challenge. I think it's a challenge to be the child of an icon, to be the child of a larger than life figure. I mean, Madam Walker was an original. There had not, there of course had been Black people who were business people. We can look at Biddy Mason in California and Mary Ellen Pleasance in California. Those were women who invested in real estate, who became quite wealthy. There were other Black men who were in business. And Madam Walker was among a circle of women who founded hair care companies. But she became larger than life. She was international. She established herself in New York. She was written about in the national press. And she had provided jobs for thousands of women. And so naturally, people were going to have expectations about her daughter. And nobody can live up to that kind of pressure. We can see that now with people who are very famous, who we know of, who have children who are struggling to find their own way. And I think A'Lelia Walker was struggling to live up to her mother's expectations, but at the same time knowing that she needed to be her own person.
Yeah, to walk her own path.
Exactly.
So what are some words that you would use to describe the dynamics of the relationship between that mother and daughter and then A'Lelia and her daughter. There seem to be some themes that kind of go through. How would you describe?
Well, there are definitely themes, and I think probably most mother and daughter relationships have some elements of love and friction, and some may lean more toward friction than affection. And their secretary, Violet Reynolds, really encapsulated it for me. I was interviewing her many, many years ago. She had gone to work for the Walker Company as a teenager in 1916. She was still working for the Walker Company in the 1970s when I was starting to do my research. And one day I asked her, I said, what was their relationship like? And she said, fire and ice. And then she sort of leaned back and she must have been having flashbacks. And she said, fire and ice. They loved each other dearly and they sometimes fought fiercely. And what I take away from that and what I know from reading their letters and from knowing what they were saying to each other, I realized it was a very deep love, but there were also reasons and times when they had conflicts with each other. Madam Walker, as the founder of a company, had certain expectations about what she thought the company should, how the company should be run. And her daughter didn't always want to do it the way she wanted it. Yeah. And then they had conflicts over the men in A'Lelia Walker's life. And that led to, a lot of arguments.
Yes, I see this theme in with them and also in other things that we see about people who have wealth and title wanting to use marriage as a way to build the empire, position themselves either politically or financially or in society. And companionship, compatibility seem to take a back seat to the ambition. And there's already the complications of being very wealthy and being very well known and having influence and being a woman. Might be hard for men to live up to that or compete in that. Can you talk a bit about that male-female relationship in mother, daughter, and grandmother?
Absolutely. And, I think that in trying to tell this story, for just to give people some context, when I wrote On Her Own Ground, The Life and Times of Madam C.J. Walker, I wanted to focus on Madam Walker as a person who developed a business, but I also was trying to begin to set the stage to develop the relationship between mother and daughter. Mm-hmm. And with Joy Goddess, I talk about that, and I talk about their relationship, and I talk about A'Lelia Walker's involvement with the business and her role as a patron of the arts. But I think this is a much more personal book in terms of developing her life, her marriages, the relationships that she had with other people. Madam Walker was, a little bit more of an enigma when it came to the personal life, but I have a lot of evidence of what A'Lelia Walker's personal life was like and the men that she married and the relationship that she had with my grandmother. And so, what I see is Madam Walker being a concerned parent. She discouraged her daughter from she discouraged A'Lelia Walker from marrying her first husband, John Robinson. The marriage lasted a really brief period of time, and mother was right, in that situation. This was a person who really kind of resented A'Lelia Walker's independence. She was a businesswoman who owned her own home, and in 1908, 1909, that was something that this particular person was not really able to deal with. And then the next episode, in a sense, Madam Walker and A'Lelia Walker were, she needed to be remarried. She didn't want to be a single woman. And she had two boyfriends, both doctors, which her mother would have approved of, both handsome, which would have attracted her. But one was a good guy and one was a bad boy, a kind of a, snooty, arrogant person, while the other was, a Dudley Do-Right in the sense. And of course, Madam Walker preferred
the bad boy.
and we know how that story goes. And I talk about that relationship and the conflict that it created and Madam Walker's own concerns about business succession and the future of her company. And so the story goes in a direction that people think they know, because sometimes the bad boy is the most interesting, but there are some other twists and turns.
Yes.
Now, you ask about the next generation. So my grandmother, May, was adopted. And Madam Walker, when she was still a poor washerwoman in St. Louis, and when A'Lelia Walker was growing up, belonged to St. Paul African Methodist Episcopal Church. That was kind of the foundation for them in many ways, and the place where other women, the more educated women, began to give Sarah Breedlove, the uneducated washerwoman, a vision of herself, helped her aspire to something more. One of the members of their church was a man named Elijah Hammond. And when Madam Walker, by now a businesswoman, moved to Indianapolis in 1910, Elijah Hammond's mother lived across the alley from her. And so in the way that we do when we go from place to place, who are your people? Who do you know? I know that person. She developed a bond with Elijah's mother, who was about the same age that her mother would have been, and began to meet other members of the family. And among those members of the family was Elijah's sister, named Sarah Etta. And she had become a widow recently with 8 children. Ooh. And one of those children was my grandmother, May. My grandmother, May, had very long braids that were long enough to sit on. And Madam Walker's main product was Madam Walker's wonderful hair grower. And so May began to serve as a model when Madam Walker was demonstrating her hair care system. And eventually, A'Lelia Walker adopted her. This is between marriages. So with May, this was kind of a Cinderella story. Yeah. She was still in contact with her biological family, but she got to travel really internationally with Madam Walker and A'Lelia Walker. She went to Spelman. She took harp lessons. So she had this seemingly, really charmed life. But A'Lelia Walker was micromanaging her life, and to the same degree that Madam Walker had tried to micromanage A'Lelia Walker's life. Mm-hmm. And the outcome of that was a marriage to someone she did not want to marry.
Yeah. I was just catching up on the episodes I missed of The Gilded Age and about New York, and got to the episode where the 18-year-old daughter is pushed into marrying a duke and is walking down the aisle crying because she doesn't want to do it.
That's right. The famous Vanderbilt story. Her mother at that point was trying to, basically a royal who didn't have a lot of money but had a castle.
Right.
And in this case, I want people to read the book and learn the twists and turns. This person that May married was not my grandfather. My grandfather was her second marriage.
Okay, don't tell anymore because it's so juicy.
It is juicy.
It really is. I mean, it's not juicy like a pot boiler, but in a sense it is. It's surrounded the emotions and the yearnings and the accomplishments, and the jet setting is part of what makes this whole story so moving. So I want to talk a bit about the book itself. You see it here. What I love about books like this is that it's like having a friend over for a long period of time. You can take your time reading it, which is what I did because I didn't want it to end. And then when I got to the end of the story, then there are all the pages about the work that you did to make this book happen. All of the places you researched, all of the people you interviewed, the years of putting it together. Can you speak a bit about that process? How long did it take from, I think I'll write a book about them, to now?
Well, so the real answer is it's 55 years because I wrote that first report about A'Lelia Walker in 1970 when I was in high school.
Wow.
On Her Own Ground came out in 2001. I wrote a couple of other books in between, but I had been noodling around with this book for many, many years, and it's taken me a long time to write it. And, I think that I am, on the one hand, I'm really fortunate that I have so much material because it is rare when you're telling the stories of African Americans and telling the stories of women to have the kind of documentation that I have. But part of Madam Walker's genius was hiring a really smart, competent executive team. And among the things that happened as a result of that is that the records were kept, the letters were kept. We have more than 40,000 documents that have been digitized. And then the Black newspapers provided a lot of information for me. Two of A'Lelia Walker's best friends were the Society columnists for the major Black newspapers.
Wow.
During the 1920s. So they would write about her every week. So I had too much material, and sort of the management of that material, and then writing the long version and then trying to edit it down so that it is compelling. And as my editors would say, a propulsive read. That was our goal.
Something that has some get up and go to it. I think you have succeeded. Can you just talk a little bit about the process? Do you write things out longhand? Do you have, as I've seen, those boards of index cards with different topics? How do you begin to put this together?
Well, all of the above. People say, well, what is your writing process? Do you get up in the morning? Do you write late at night? Well, I do all of that, whatever is called for. But I got a really great piece of advice when I was seriously starting to do this research. In the early 80s, Alex Haley, the author of Roots, came to us because he wanted to write about Madam Walker and wanted to do a miniseries. And I was doing the research for that project. He never completed his projects, but in some ways came into my life, I think, to put me on the path. But the piece of advice he gave me was this. He said, make a folder for every year of your character's life. And as you get a little piece of information or as you have a thought, just drop it into that folder. Well, now I have like 2 rooms of folders with those timelines and the individuals. I have more than 1,000 people whose folders of them, because those are the characters who populate my book, or major organizations or cities or the nightclubs in Harlem or various things. So that became the basis of my research. Now, because I started that many, many years ago, I have a lot of paper. Through the years, I have digitized some things, but the other key part for me in organizing this is that I've done extremely detailed chronology. So I would take an excerpt from a letter or a newspaper article for the year 1916, and every month of that year, I'm writing things in. And so that became the foundation for the manuscript ultimately.
Wow. As I was reading all of that, I just was trying to picture living in this world, especially in the last few years, for so long. I know there are times when I've called you to talk about you. I'm writing now. My editor wants something. I remember this over the last few years.
Several years.
Yes, exactly. So now you're on a whirlwind book tour. I see the list of places you're going to be, and I'm sure more are coming in. What has surprised you or delighted you or alarmed you about people's reception to the book or the questions or comments that they make?
When you write a book, you don't know how it's going to be received. You know the things that you think are important, but you don't know how it's going to land with other people. And so it has just been a delight for me to listen to people say, oh, this is different from what I thought, because so much of the material about A'Lelia Walker is inaccurate. She's been kind of caricatured by many of the people who've written about the Harlem Renaissance. She's as a party girl, a dilettante, somebody who wasn't really a patron of the arts. One Harlem Renaissance historian who's a really great scholar, but who portrayed her as a person who spent the 1920s playing bridge. Now, bridge is a hard game, so if that was meant as a put down, but I think it was meant as a put down. But it's so missed the point of her life. And one of the things that's been gratifying to me is one person who said what they discovered about A'Lelia Walker is that she did this with intention, that when she hosted a party, it wasn't just to hang out and drink. It was to bring people together. It was to bring together her uptown friends in Harlem, her downtown friends, which meant white friends, her international friends, because she had traveled internationally to Paris, London, Rome, Monte Carlo, Addis Ababa, Cairo, her queer friends and her straight friends, that everybody was equally welcome. And she had the talent of curating these groups of people, and always with live music, with her musician friends, with great food, with great drink. And it was prohibition, but she made sure that all of the elements were there for a great gathering.
Thank you so much, A'Lelia. Reading the book has been fun. Speaking with you has been fun. And this is not our last time talking about this. We are going to be together during the festival on September 21st at what we're calling the Dark Tower Day Party. That's part of our festival, the 21st in the afternoon in Washington, D.C. So we hope all of the people who are listening now can come in person. It's going to be like one of those parties at the Dark Tower. I'm trying my best to make it like that. So I think people would be very excited and pleased to be a part of it. So it's going to be a part Uptown Art Salon, part Afternoon of the Cotton Club, and we'll be celebrating the Harlem Renaissance and the cultural connection to today. We'll have elegant food and libation, some music, some surprise pop-up performances, and special presentation. And of course, your books will be there as well, and so will you. So that's 2:00, Sunday, September 21st at the Auto Shop in Union Market. Go on the festival website for details and for tickets. And so now I would like to say goodbye for now. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you live or virtually at the March On Festival coming up in September. March on.